share my screen.
Folks, I would like to introduce Mary Ann Hansen. Mary Ann is an instructor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. She's 20% teaching appointment, 80% extension, and she's also the co-manager for the Virginia Tech Plant Disease Clinic. She has a bachelor's in plant pathology from Ohio State University and a master's in plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So thank you, Mary Ann, for speaking with us this evening. And she's going to be talking with us about vegetable diseases in the home garden. So Mary Ann, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm delighted that many of you have chosen to come listen to this on such a nice day. It's really nice outside here in Blacksburg anyway. Okay, so Phil asked me to talk about some of the common vegetable disease problems and their management in home gardens in our neck of the woods. And it's, there are a lot of common vegetable diseases. And so I had to kind of pick and choose what to focus on. And Phil gave me some ideas of the kinds of problems that you guys typically see in your area. So I'm going to try to focus on some of those. But I also want to talk about disease management in a general way, because a lot of the disease management practices that we use would apply to a lot of the different diseases you might encounter in your vegetable garden. So I want to start out just talking about a few general principles and just a couple of general ideas, and then we'll get into some of the specific diseases that you might see. And then I want to kind of circle back to some more specifics on some of these disease management options. The first thing I would say is that unfortunately we have no silver bullets for managing vegetable diseases in the home garden. So typically you're going to have to use an integrated approach to get good control of your vegetable diseases or any other diseases in your yard. And the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, definitely comes into play when you're managing diseases, because we don't have a lot of options for getting rid of a disease once it's appeared. So it's really important to take the time to plan your garden and think about, what you're going to plant and, how you're going to keep those plants healthy and other ways that you can prevent disease. So I'm going to emphasize that with some of the disease controls that I talk about tonight as well. And then the third thing that I would like you to remember as we go through this talk is that it's really important to get a good diagnosis of a problem. So you may think you know what's wrong with your plant, but there are a lot of things that can look similar. And if you don't know what caused the problem, you're not going to know what type of measure is going to control it. And unfortunately, with diseases, we're talking about a lot of different possible causes of the problem. So, when you're talking about insect damage or arthropod damage, you're basically, identifying insects or mites, that sort of thing. With diseases, we're talking about different kinds of pathogens. And we have all different kinds of pathogens from several of the different kingdoms of life. So it can be hard, and it's important to know which one you've got to know what control measure is going to work. So most diseases that you're going to encounter are caused by fungi, and we're all familiar with fungi, molding things in our refrigerator when they've been in there too long, that sort of thing. So fungi grow by this structure called mycelium, which is a network of thread-like structures. They produce spores, which spread, and each spore can cause a new infection. And there are lots of different species of fungi that cause plant disease. And there are also another group of organisms that you probably haven't heard about specifically before. They're called oomycetes, and they look a lot like fungi, but they're actually in a completely different kingdom, and they are controlled by different chemicals than fungi in general. Then we have bacterial diseases. Bacteria are single-celled organisms that just divide and divide and divide and spread as single cells. We have even members of the animal kingdom that are considered plant pathogens, the nematodes, which are microscopic roundworms, and many of the nematodes live in the soil and feed on plant roots. And then we also have viruses. We're all way too familiar with viruses of humans at this point in the COVID-19 epidemic, but there are also viruses that attack plants, and many of them are transmitted by insects. So then we also have to think about, possible insect control to control a disease. And then we have a few higher plants that are seed-producing plants, but they can't produce their own chlorophyll, and they attach to and get their nutrients from other plants. So these are all the different kinds of organisms that you have to be familiar with if you're in working in disease diagnosis. So I just wanted to point those out. So when I'm talking about some of these different diseases, you'll think back to these different types of pathogens, and maybe you can place some of the diseases that I'm talking about. Another thing that we want to do pretty early on when trying to figure out what is causing a problem is decide whether it's biotic or abiotic in cause. And basically that just means living versus non-living. So biotic means that the problem is caused by some kind of living organism, either one of these pathogens that I just mentioned, or possibly an insect or a mite. Whereas an abiotic problem is a non-living problem, something like fertilizer burn or frost injury or chemical injury. So any of these kinds of non-living factors can cause symptoms on plants, and they can look like disease. So it can be kind of tricky to figure out what the problem is. So a couple of tips when you're trying to figure this out yourself in your own garden. Symptoms of abiotic problems or non-living factors typically show up in a pattern. And so whether that pattern is on the plant part or on the plant as a whole or in the planting, you'll typically see some kind of pattern. So, if you spread too much fertilizer, then you'll see a pattern that follows the fertilizer spreader. If you have frost injury, you'll see it in, areas where cold air collects. So, be on the lookout for some type of pattern, which can often indicate an abiotic problem. And the reason it's important to distinguish between these two is that, you're not going to want to go out and spray a pesticide if you've got an abiotic problem. And maybe you caused the problem yourself by over applying something. So you want to figure that out. The other clue about abiotic problems is that they often have sudden onset. So often many of these abiotic problems are episodic in nature. They relate to, something that was applied or a weather condition that happened at one point in time. And then you see the symptoms. And then after that, you don't see any new symptoms or spread. So those are a couple of tips for figuring out whether you've got an abiotic problem or not. Biotic problems, on the other hand, problems caused by living organisms, typically the symptoms are randomly distributed. So, especially for things like fungi and bacteria that spread by wind and splashing rain, wherever one of the cells or of the bacteria or spores of the fungi land, you're going to get infection at that point. And so they're going to land at random places on the plant or on the plant surface. And the symptoms will typically be randomly distributed on the plant or in the field. So here you see an example of a fungal disease in a tomato planting, and you can see, some of the plants look great, and yet there are scattered pockets where the plants don't look good. So often you'll see that kind of random distribution in the planting as well. And biotic problems will tend to develop gradually. So that's another clue. If you see a few symptoms one day and then slowly over the next few weeks, you see that develop and spread, that's more likely to be a biotic problem. So just a few tips I wanted to give you on distinguishing biotic and abiotic problems. We'll talk about some examples of both of these tonight. In terms of disease and disease control, plant pathologists like to talk about the concept of the disease triangle. So basically the idea is that you have to have all sides of the triangle to get disease. You have to have a susceptible host and a pathogen landing on it that can infect that host. And then you also have to have a favorable environment for that pathogen to grow and infect. And if you have all three sides of the triangle, then you have disease. And so you can think of the disease triangle in sort of the opposite way, where if you would break any one side of this triangle, then you would be able to control the disease, because you can't get disease unless you have all three. So some examples would be resistant varieties. So many varieties of different vegetables are bred for resistance to certain diseases. And so if you have a resistant variety, even if the pathogen that normally could infect tomatoes lands on that host, it will not be able to infect it. And so you've broken that side of the triangle and you basically controlled the disease. So that's one way to go about it. Another way that we commonly use is pesticides, or in the case of disease, it's usually fungicides. That's basically the only type of pathogen that we control very readily with chemicals. But basically, if you're spraying a chemical, you're trying to inhibit the growth of the pathogen. And so you're breaking that side of the triangle. And, even if you had the right pathogen on a susceptible host, sometimes you can manipulate the environment so that the conditions are not conducive for infection. So things like staking and properly spacing your plants. A lot of diseases are caused by fungi. Fungi like moist, humid conditions. And so if you can improve the air circulation and reduce the humidity, a lot of times you can break that side of the triangle. So I just wanted you to think about some of these general concepts, because I'm going to be mentioning some of the controls that would be relevant for some of the different diseases I talk about tonight. And you can kind of think back to the disease triangle and think about, which side of the triangle are we trying to break? And, sometimes it may be more than one side. Okay, so let me ask you, Phil, can you all see my whole slide, or is there anything blocking it? Because I'm getting messages about people being admitted and so forth.
Yes, you can see the whole thing.
You can see those messages as well, or you see the whole slide?
I see the whole slide, yes.
Okay, so you're not seeing those messages. Okay, great. Okay, so the first disease that Phil asked me to talk about was Bean Anthracnos, and this is a very common disease in a lot of parts of Virginia. I first want to explain this term anthracnose. You'll hear that often with respect to plant diseases, and that's kind of a general term, and it just means that the disease is caused by a group of related fungi, the Anthracnose fungi. So there are anthracnose diseases of bean, of tomato, of dogwood, of lots of different kinds of plants, and they're not necessarily all the same species. So just wanted to clarify that. So the bean anthracnose pathogen is pretty specific to bean, and you'll get these sunken spots on the pods. We don't really see symptoms on the leaves, but you'll get these horrible looking spots on the pods. And you can also see the spots on the lima beans on the left, not quite as sunken, but on green beans and other beans, you see those sunken spots. And they will often have a lot of little dots of a salmon colored kind of gooey looking material in them. And those are clusters of fungal spores. And each one of those little teeny dots within the pod spot can have hundreds and hundreds of spores, and each fungal spore can start a new infection. So it can be really hard to control once you've got some spots on your beans, because those spores are being produced and being spread. And so you want to avoid working in your plants when the plants are wet, because then you're more likely to pick those spores up on your clothing and go walk along and spread it to some plant that hasn't been infected yet. So anything you can do to reduce the humidity or the wetness in the canopy is going to help control this disease, including avoiding overhead irrigation. And I'll say that in general for probably most of the diseases I talk about tonight that are caused by fungi or bacteria, that you would want to avoid overhead irrigation. If you can at all water from below, that's a better idea, because just that humidity in the canopy is going to encourage different pathogens to get going on a variety of plants. And then removing the plant debris at the end of the season or as it accumulates, or incorporating it into the soil at the end of the season, just not leaving it laying around on the soil surface is a good idea for many of these pathogens. because a lot of pathogens such as the Bean Anthracnos fungus can survive on the plant debris. So that's another control measure that's that works well, especially for pathogens that survive on the debris or survive in the soil, on the surface of the soil. And then we do have resistant varieties for Bean Anthracnos. I was checking some of the online catalogs the other night just to see what was available, and there were several different cultivars of beans that have been bred for resistance to this disease. So that is a good good control measure that you can use preventatively if you spend enough time planning your garden ahead of time and you know kind of what diseases you're likely to get. Okay, so that's a fungal disease. We're going to talk about another fungal disease on bean. It's called bean rust. And again, this term rust is a name of a group of fungi. So there are a lot of different species of rust fungi, each of which has its own life cycle and own set of plant hosts. The bean rust fungus is pretty restricted to beans. And the other reason for the name rust fungi is that they produce very brightly colored spores, or kind of a range from yellow to orange to rust to cinnamon brown. And so the bean rust fungus will appear on bean leaves as these cinnamon colored pustules. And here you can see them up close. And so even though individual spores, like you can see on this micrograph picture taken on a microscope in the upper right-hand corner, even though those spores are microscopic, if you get enough of them in a cluster and they're colored, then you can see them. And so the rust fungi produce these brightly colored spores in pustules, which are just fruiting structures that these fungi produce that look like they've kind of broken through the leaf surface. So here you can see some of those rust spores close up. And if you look at the spots where those pustules are forming on the leaves, you'll often see a yellow halo around them. And I think you can see that, you know, on those leaves on the left-hand picture as well, but you can see it even better on this close-up. And so a lot of fungi and bacteria will produce toxins that ooze out into the surrounding tissue and cause yellowing around them. So that's another indication that you might have a pathogen there. And to control bean rust, there are a number of resistant varieties. And you may say, why do I care about controlling it? The symptoms appear to be on the leaves only, and we do not see those pustules on the pods. But the problem is that if you damage a lot of the leaf tissue, then those leaves aren't producing as much carbohydrate. And so the plant is not able to support as many pods. So this is kind of a yield reducing disease. And so you can use resistant varieties. If you forgot to pick a resistant variety and you get the disease anyway, you can use fungicides preventatively to prevent infection. Okay, I'm going to move on to a disease of tomato. And this is a disease that occurs rather sporadically in Virginia. You have to have that favorable environment side of the disease triangle for this disease to really get going. This is a disease caused by an oomycete, so it's a fungus-like organism. And you know, for your purposes, you look at it, it looks like a fungus. You can see that kind of white fluffy growth on that infected leaf on the right-hand picture here. And late blight is the same disease that caused the Irish potato famine in the mid-19th century. And this is another point I want to make about a lot of pathogens. So many pathogens are specialized to infect a given plant species or a set of related species. So usually you'll see a pathogen attacking plants, you know, in the same family. So you typically wouldn't see the same pathogen attacking plants in a lot of different plant families. And I'll talk to you in a little bit about how we can use that in controlling diseases of vegetables in the garden. So late blight occurred in potato in Ireland in the mid-19th century, and potato is in the same family as tomato, Solanaceae. And it was so devastating in Ireland, and maybe some of you have Irish ancestry that traces back to that plant disease, because a lot of people left Ireland and came to the United States because of this epidemic. So late blight basically wiped out the entire potato crop in Ireland. And part of the problem was that potato is propagated vegetatively. So every potato plant in the whole country was basically the same, the same cultivar, and it was not resistant to late blight. And so once the disease got going and the weather conditions were right for it, Ireland had a couple of weeks of really wet, overcast weather, and the disease just spread very rapidly. And it can affect all different parts of the plant. So here you see it on the leaves, and you see it on the petioles, and you can also see it on the stems, and it'll really get going in prolonged wet, cloudy weather. And so, I did say that abiotic problems tend to appear rather suddenly, whereas biotic problems tend to spread gradually. This is one exception to that rule. If the weather conditions are right for late blight, it will spread so fast that people will think it's an abiotic problem. But if you look closely, you'll see the organism right growing on the plant tissue. And here you can see some of the lesions on the stems, these big irregular brown lesions, and the fruit can also be infected. And it's just kind of a blotchy brown rot. And so it's basically wiping out the whole plant. The whole plant can melt down within a period of days under the right conditions. And often with the fruit, you'll see the lesions starting at the stem end of the fruit, I think because water collects there. And this is an organism that really likes wet conditions. It produces swimming spores, and those spores need free water. And so if you get water collecting at the stem end, then the spores, if they land there, can infect directly from there. So this is a really horrible disease when it does occur. Fortunately, it doesn't occur every year. You can control it with preventative sprays of fungicide, but people forget to spray fungicide, and if the weather conditions aren't right, you're not going to get this disease. But to use fungicides judiciously, you would want to look at the weather forecast, and if you see a prolonged wet, cloudy period, then you might want to think about this, about preventing this disease. And of course, when you're choosing varieties before you plant your garden, look for resistant varieties. There are more and more of these. So back in the 60s, there were none, but fortunately, Dr. Manon Gallagly, who's at West Virginia University, was both a plant pathologist and a breeder, and developed a tomato variety that was resistant to late blight. And that, to my knowledge, is the first one, the first resistant tomato variety to late blight. And Dr. Gallagly is still at West Virginia University, and you'll see his name again. But Centennial is one of the first varieties, and that really triggered more breeding efforts. And now we have quite a few different types of tomatoes with some resistant varieties. For example, Defiant is a slicer tomato that has resistance to late blight, and there are others as well. So you may not find your favorite variety of tomato having late blight resistance, but it's always good to plant one or maybe two of these late blight resistant varieties, just in case we have the kind of growing season that is really conducive to this disease, because once you see it, it's too late to control it. The pathogen, the late blight pathogen, does not overwinter in Virginia. So this is not one where you have to worry about it being in the plant debris. So that's a good thing. It's blowing in from somewhere else every year when it gets started in Virginia. And it's a problem on tomatoes and potatoes. But another disease of tomato that is on my high priority list in terms of common vegetable diseases in Virginia is Septoria leaf spot of tomato. And this is a disease we've actually seen more and more of as the years have gone by. We never go through a season in the plant disease clinic without diagnosing a bunch of tomatoes with Septoria leaf spot. And the initial symptom is a leaf spot symptom, like you see on that leaf on the right there. So you see some scattered dead spots on the leaves with some characteristic yellow halos around those spots. But what people will tell you is, by the time they notice it, they're saying that the leaves are dying from the bottom up, or they may say the plant seems to be wilting from the bottom up. Plant's not really wilting. It's just that the disease is starting as a leaf spot on those lower leaves, and then it spreads, kills the whole leaf, and so the leaves will be browning from the bottom of the plant up. And of course, down in the canopy, it's nice and humid, favorable environment for that fungus to develop. And that's why you get it moving from the bottom up. And I'm embarrassed to say that this picture on the left is my own tomato. I'm a plant pathologist, so I don't have time to go spray fungicides in the summer. So I'm always looking for resistant varieties. And unfortunately, until very recently, we have had no options for resistant varieties for this disease. And so basically, currently, the best way to control this disease would be with regular sprays of a preventative fungicide, and also controlling the environment by staking and spacing your tomatoes better than I've done here. Also sanitation. So this fungus can survive on the leaf debris. So for a lot of these diseases, it's just good to clear out that leaf debris and not leave it there on the soil surface so that it can overwinter and infect your plants next year. But resistance, I'm happy to say, is sort of on its way. And I thought it was really funny that right before this talk tonight, I got an email from a group in West Virginia that got some funding, grant funding, to develop more of what they've been working on there. And it's the same guy, Manon Gallagly, up at West Virginia University. He is now 98 years old, and he is still working on his Septoria resistant tomatoes. And finally, he's getting some good results. So his varieties have not been commercialized yet, but they're working on it. I've gotten some seed from him and planted in my own garden, and those plants have done a lot better with the Septoria. So, if you're in your 90s, don't feel like you don't have a lot of work still to do. And I called up to West Virginia University a couple of weeks ago, and Manon was out in his field plots looking at his Septoria resistant tomatoes. So I'm glad they're working on that still. Okay, Phil asked me to talk about at least one vascular wilt disease, but I'm going to talk about several because the vascular wilt diseases are kind of a group of diseases, and some of them are caused by fungi and some of them are caused by bacteria. But the common theme with these vascular wilt diseases is that these pathogens get into the xylem, or the water conducting vessels in the stem. So the plant wilts because the xylem is clogged up and the water can't move from the soil through the roots to the leaves. And the other thing you'll see with these that's pretty common to vascular wilt diseases is this vascular discoloration. So you can see that in these pictures here, whether in cross section or in longitudinal section, you can see the brown tissue, the brown woody tissue, that's the xylem, or water conducting vessels inside the stem. And you won't see any rot on the outside of the plant. So we have other diseases that cause root rots and stem rots and so forth. But with a vascular wilt disease, all you'll see is the wilting, and then you won't see, any telltale signs unless you cut into that stem and see that vascular browning or vascular discoloration. And there are other vegetables than tomato that get vascular wilts. I'm going to talk about bacterial wilt of cucurbits in a minute. But tomatoes get several different vascular wilts. So they get a couple of fungal vascular wilts, Verticillium wilt, Fusarium wilt, and then they get a bacterial vascular wilt called bacterial wilt. And all of these organisms are soil-borne. And so it's really difficult to control them. And we really, don't have any chemicals that will work for control. So, so the picture on the left here is turned out to be Verticillium wilt. And basically we can't, these vascular wilt diseases all look the same. So you would probably not be able to tell them apart unless you had a lab diagnosis done, certainly not the fungal vascular wilts, because what we do is culture from that vascular tissue and then identify the fungus that's causing that vascular discoloration. But if it's bacterial wilt, you can actually do a cool little test yourself and impress your friends and neighbors. So with fungi growing in the vascular tissue, there's kind of no growth that you can see there. But with bacteria, if they're in the vascular tissue, they are just piles and piles of single cells. And you can get them to come out of the xylem if you do this little trick. So you take a little piece of the vascular tissue that's brown, and you could just take a thin slice of it after you've washed the soil off the stem and so forth. And then you can stick that little piece of stem tissue to the side of a glass and put the cut end of it right below the surface of the water. And then if you wait 5 or 10 minutes and come back and look, you can see that milky ooze just dumping out of the xylem. So you can see that where that yellow arrow is, you can see that kind of milky stuff coming out of the xylem. So you can see why that plant was wilting. All those bacteria were in there blocking water transport. If you had a healthy plant, or if you had a plant that did not have bacterial wilt, you wouldn't see that milky ooze. So that's your own little diagnostic tip for the evening, little test you can do at home if you think that you've got bacterial wilt in your tomatoes, and it is a pretty common disease. Now, the problem, like I said, with these vascular wilt diseases is that there are no chemical controls. These organisms survive in the soil. We don't want to be dumping a bunch of chemical on the soil to try to control them. And there just are no effective chemical controls. So you're going to have to rely on things like resistant varieties, or, crop rotation. If you have a vascular wilt disease of tomato diagnosed in your garden, then you could plant an unrelated crop in there the following year, and then that would not be susceptible to the same disease that the tomato got. So these are a couple of options for vascular wilt diseases. This bacterial wilt is actually a huge problem in Africa, and people have developed a different technique where they actually graft tomato plants onto eggplant rootstock that's resistant to the disease. So that's another interesting way to control the disease, but I haven't seen people doing that over here. That would be would take a lot of time. But we do have some resistant varieties depending on the pathogen, and you'll see varieties called VFN varieties, and the V and F in that, these are tomato varieties, stands for Verticillium and Fusarium. So there are a number of resistant varieties for some of these diseases, and some of them even have multiple resistance, like the Verticillium and Fusarium resistance in the same plant. Okay, so a totally different bacterial wilt disease caused by a different species of bacterium is bacterial wilt of cucurbits. And mainly that disease occurs on cucumbers and cantaloupe. So some of the other cucurbits, we don't really see that disease in them very often at all. Things like pumpkin and watermelon and squash, we really don't see bacterial wilt in those crops. So it's mainly a problem with cucumber and cantaloupe. And you'll see individual vines wilting during the heat of the day, and then finally they just permanently wilt and don't recover. And you can use that same little technique that I showed you. You can cut a little sliver of the vascular system in the stem and put it in water and see if bacteria dump out. And typically, if you've got wilting in cucumbers and cantaloupe, that's the most common disease that you might see. And in the case of this bacterial wilt disease, the bacterium is transmitted by an insect. So it's transmitted specifically by striped and spotted cucumber beetles. And so the control really relies on controlling these beetles and preventing the spread, because like I said, with vascular wilt diseases, we don't have any chemicals we can spray for the pathogen itself. But if you can prevent the feeding by these beetles, then you'll prevent the transmission, because they're the guys that are bringing it in to the vascular system. So controlling the beetles might involve using row covers that would allow the light in, but not the insects, or possibly insecticides to control those beetles. And there are some what are called tolerant varieties, but there are not any really good resistant varieties as far as I know to this particular disease. I wanted to mention another problem that's actually an abiotic problem that you could confuse with a vascular wilt disease, and that is walnut wilt, which we can see on different vegetables, but we typically mainly see it on tomato. And so if you've got a wilting tomato and you don't see any stem rot or anything that would be inhibiting the water flow, and if you dug it up and the roots looked healthy, then it's hard to figure out why it's wilting. We can see from this picture, it's probably not wilting because of drought, because the squash plants in the background look fine. And so, you might cut that stem open to look for that vascular discoloration. And in this case, you would see that vascular discoloration. So it looks like a vascular wilt disease, but it's actually an abiotic problem. And, you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you know that there's a walnut tree nearby. So in this case, the tomato is there in the red circle, and then you can see the foliage of the walnut tree in the upper left-hand corner of that picture there. And this was my garden some years back. And this tomato is actually even outside the drip line of that tree, but the black walnut tree produces a compound called juglone that is toxic to many different plants that might grow around it. From what I've read, you have to have root to root contact. So, it would basically have to be within the root zone. And typically you only see the damage on the deeper rooted vegetables like tomato. So those squash plants are nearby also, but they're very shallow rooted and they're not suffering from that juglone. So this is an abiotic problem to be aware of. And there's not a whole lot you can do besides cutting down the walnut tree, or planting your garden farther away, or perhaps digging a trench between the tree and the garden. Another soil-borne problem that I wanted to mention is root knot nematodes. So we talked about nematodes also being a type of pathogen. These are microscopic roundworms that live in the soil, and they swim through films of moisture in the soil. There are quite a few different species of plant feeding nematodes in Virginia. There are lots of nematodes that don't even feed on plants, but we have a number of plant parasitic nematodes in Virginia. But the one that we find most commonly is called root knot nematode. And that's the easiest one to recognize because it causes these very conspicuous galls on the roots. And the bad thing about these nematodes, including the root knot nematode, which there are several species of root knot nematode, they have a broad host range. So they kind of defy that rule that I said earlier about pathogens kind of being restricted to one family of plants. So the root knot nematodes can attack a broad range of plants. They'll form these galls on the roots, and then the plants will wilt, or they'll be stunted or yellowed. And if they're all affected, you might not even notice it unless they're growing near some healthy plants. So they're kind of they cause symptoms that are not very diagnostic, symptoms that could be caused by root rot diseases or nutrient deficiency or something like that. But if you dig up the roots and you see these swellings on the root, like I think you can see on this beet root here, the galls, that is indicative of root knot nematode. The female nematode burrows into the root and causes proliferation of cells around her to protect her. And so she's in that gall laying her eggs, and there she is. So if you had magnification and you were really careful picking around in these galls, then you might see these little balloon-shaped structures, and those are two females there on the root. And so the female swells up and produces her eggs in that sac-like structure while she's feeding from the root cells. And we do not have any nematicides that are registered for use in home gardens. So there are chemicals that will kill nematodes. They tend to be chemicals that kill lots of things in the soil, and they are restricted use pesticides, and they're not registered for use in home gardens. So we don't have any chemical options for controlling root knot nematode or any other nematode in home gardens. So once you've got a diagnosis of nematodes in your soil, that's a bad problem, because these females are in the soil and there's eggs in the soil. And if you transport that soil somewhere else, you can infest another area. So you want to definitely be careful about moving soil from one area to another. And this is another case where it is really important to get a good diagnosis, so you know what you have in your garden and what you have in your soil. And if you get this diagnosis, you want to be very careful about, even walking in that infested area and then walking in another area, because you could be carrying soil on your shoes that would contain the females or the eggs. And here you see another picture of root knot nematode on lima bean. And hopefully, if you've ever seen lima bean roots, you know that these are not normal lima bean roots. They're heavily, heavily galled. And I think you can get some idea of why that plant cannot transport water from the soil through the roots to the leaves. And so the plant wilts. So the root system is just completely distorted. In the right-hand picture, you can see a thin section showing a root knot female in a root taken on a microscope. And so you see that sac-like structure with the projection at the one end. That's her head, where she's feeding on those cells, and she's caused the plant to produce those cells around her in that gall. So what can we do about root knot nematode when we don't have any chemical controls? Adding organic matter to the soil is always a good idea, because organic matter contains a variety of microbes, some of which are antagonistic to the nematodes. So higher organic matter is going to be helpful. Some people try to plant what some people call a trap crop, which is marigolds. And this trap crop terminology is kind of a misnomer, because people come away thinking that marigolds will trap the nematodes in their roots, and that they can just plant them between their vegetables, but that's not how it works. So marigolds will produce a chemical that is toxic to nematodes and keeps them from reproducing. So they can help to lower nematode populations in the soil, but basically you have to plant that whole infested area to the marigolds for a season and then plow it in. So, just planting rows of marigolds between your vegetable crops is not going to work. But it can be helpful in reducing nematode populations if you plant it for a whole season in infested soil. And the French marigolds, that's one species of marigold, are supposedly better at doing that than others. There are some resistant varieties of some vegetables, including tomatoes, varieties that are resistant to root knot nematode. So those varieties I mentioned before, the VFN varieties, the V and the F stand for Verticillium and Fusarium wilt, but the N stands for nematodes, basically root knot nematode. So those varieties are resistant to the most common species of root knot nematode. And so that can be a good option if you've had root knot nematodes diagnosed in your garden before. And rotation to corn can also be useful. Corn can get root knot nematode, but it doesn't really. The one it gets is not found in Virginia commonly. So you could rotate to corn, and then the pathogen wouldn't be able to infect the roots. So those are some options if you get a diagnosis of root knot nematode in your garden. Okay, I want to talk about at least one virus disease. And so I'm going to show you pictures of this watermelon mosaic virus. This is pictured on zucchini. So the cucurbits in general get a lot of virus diseases, and they will cause symptoms like mosaic, which is this kind of patchy yellow and green coloration to the leaves. And then you'll often also get distortion of the leaves, which I think you can see on that right-hand picture. So these are symptoms on zucchini. The virus happens to be named watermelon mosaic virus, but it also attacks zucchini. You can see a cucumber plant in the background that looks like the leaves are normal. And a lot of these viruses can attack all the different cucurbit plants, but there are more cucumbers that have been bred for resistance to some of these virus diseases than some of the other cucurbit plants. So I think what's going on there, this was somebody sent this in for diagnosis, is that they planted a resistant cucumber, but they got the disease in their zucchini. And, you know, the fruit can also be kind of mosaic-y and distorted. Still edible. These are plant viruses. They're not going to attack you. But, you know, the plants don't look that great. They're probably not going to yield as much. And most plant virus diseases, not all, but most, are transmitted by insects. So insects that have piercing sucking mouth parts like aphids or white flies or some other insects, thrips, when they feed, they poke their mouth part into the cell and suck out the cell contents. And if there's virus in there, they'll suck up the virus too. And then when they go feed on a healthy plant, they'll transmit that in their saliva. So here's another case where we've got a disease, but the main control would be to control the insect, because we don't have any chemicals that are effective directly for viruses. So you've got to rely on controlling the insect vector, or planting resistant varieties like you see with that cucumber. That's doing very well, even though obviously the insect vector is there and the virus is there. So those symptoms of the mosaic are very characteristic of virus. There's almost nothing else that would cause that, unless you had like a genetic, a variety that was bred for variegation, but typically it wouldn't be bred for that distortion. So you can usually tell that it's a virus. But while we're talking about distortion, I want to mention one other very common thing that we see in the plant disease clinic, and that's chemical injury from growth regulator type herbicides. And these herbicides will cause distortion of the new growth, and they can damage plants in a number of ways. They can drift. So if somebody's using one of them for weed control on a lawn, they can drift over to your vegetable garden. On a hot day, they can simply volatilize and damage at low concentrations. Or, and this is the thing that we're finding more and more these days, they can be present as residues in things that people are using in their garden, like straw mulch or compost, or even manure that they're using for fertilizer. So if those products came from a pasture or a field that was treated with one of these growth regulator herbicides, those residues can exist in that material, and they can even survive passage through the animal digestive tract and be present in manure. So, a lot of people during COVID were planting their own gardens, and they were trying to be very organic about it, and, buying composted manure and compost in general, and didn't realize that these growth regulator herbicides could be present as residues in those products. And so, we've seen a lot of damage caused by that, where no herbicide had been used in the area, but somebody applied compost to their garden and saw a lot of damage. And you can see that these tomato leaves, these are the new leaves, they're completely curled up like little snails, and they're very distorted. The older leaves can look kind of strap-like, and you'll also get distortion of the fruit. And so this is not a good thing, but a very common thing. Symptoms could be caused by a virus, but in most cases they're caused by growth regulator herbicides. Okay. One more I want to tell you about. and that is basil downy mildew, very common in basil now. And the symptoms are not totally obvious. So it just kind of looks like the leaves are starting to senesce early, like maybe, oh, maybe the end of the season is coming a little early this year. And it'll significantly reduce the amount of harvest you'll get from those plants. And if you're like me and you like to make pesto, that's really a bummer. It's easy to miss these symptoms. They can start out as just kind of irregular yellowing or irregular browning. You may think something damaged the leaves. Here you see a variety that's a little more resistant to this disease, but you can see that kind of irregular yellowing. And if you turn those leaves over, you might see that kind of dirty look to the underside of the leaf. And those are the spores of the downy mildew organism. And they're present on the lower leaf surface. And you may think soil splashed up on the plants, but that's the spores of the downy mildew. And so this has been a real problem for basil lovers of sweet basil. And so breeders went to work right away trying to develop some resistant varieties. And we now have a number of good choices of resistant varieties. That's all I plant anymore because this disease is so prevalent. And there are a number of them. So ask your supplier, your local greenhouse or whatever, to sell these varieties. I went to mine this year and the plants weren't marked, so I didn't buy them. And then later I found out that it was one of these resistant varieties. So hopefully they're marked, but if not, ask about them. And if you want to learn more about this disease, if you're a basil lover, I have a short video on the Virginia Master Gardener YouTube channel about this disease. And then we did a follow-up where I interviewed Alex Hessler, who used to run the organic farm at Virginia Tech. And he did a big variety trial with a bunch of these varieties. And we look at how they did in that variety trial. So take a look at those videos on the Master Gardener YouTube channel. Okay, I had a number of kind of disease control slides, but I think I'm going to wrap it up so you guys will have time for questions. I just want to remind you, that it's really important to use an integrated approach and not rely on chemicals alone, because most of the chemicals that we have are preventative in nature. They protect the tissue from infection, but they're not going to go and eliminate a problem after it's already occurred. They can still be a very important part of a disease management program. And you'll want to look at the pest management guide. In Virginia, we have the Virginia pest management guides, and one of them is for home grounds and animals. And there's a section on vegetable diseases with a page that shows the common fungicides that you might find, at the local store. And then details on, how to apply them for the different diseases, some of the ones that I've talked about. So definitely, think about chemicals as part of your overall approach, but I hope that you'll do a lot more with planning and trying to pick out resistant varieties, trying to, plan your garden so that you can routinely stake and space your plants enough so that you get good air circulation around them. Those types of cultural controls will go a long way to preventing some of these diseases that I've talked about. And I think I'll end there, Phil, so that we have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, thank you. And if anyone has a question, they can either unmute themselves or just type it in the chat box. And while we're waiting, Mary Ann, I had one about the bean anthracnose, and I think it's fair to say that all three of our counties here, people are very loyal to a certain variety of bean. And I know in one of our Virginia Cooperative Extension handouts, there's a hot water treatment.
Okay, yeah.
How effective is that? I've shared it with folks, but I've never heard feedback on if they treated their seed and then did not see anthracnose.
Okay, good question. So some of these pathogens can be seed-borne, and that is one of them. So if you're, careful about following all the directions with the hot water seed treatment so that you're not overheating the seed so that it won't germinate anymore, then that will eliminate seed-borne infection. So that can be a good start. especially if you really want to plant varieties that are susceptible to the disease. The problem is that, the disease is going to be around, and depending on how close it is to your garden, it could be moved by, rain. Mostly with that disease, it would be more water movement rather than wind, because those spores are in this kind of gooey mass, so they're kind of sticky and they're probably not as easily windborne. So definitely, especially if you're saving your seed, saving your own seed, but if you're buying susceptible seed, either get it from a source where they treat their seed, or you could try that hot water seed treatment. Yeah, definitely that is a seed-borne pathogen. Good point.
And I don't know if you can see the chat box from where you are, Mary Ann.
Maybe I should stop sharing my screen here.
Greta had asked for a differentiation between early blight and Septoria.
Okay, very good. I guess I'll keep my screen up. Hold on. Yeah, and I apologize because you did ask me to cover early blight, Phil. And I'm just going to go back to my Septoria slide. And early blight is somewhat similar, but with Septoria leaf spot, you can see where a bunch of these spots have grown together, but they're all basically, the individual spots are kind of the same size. They're small, they're kind of angular. With early blight, you will get a big spots, small spots, and they'll often have concentric rings. So you'll see kind of a target pattern in the spot, and you will not see that with Septoria. Also, this thing about the leaves dying from the bottom up, that is less of a thing with early blight. Okay, early blight is just caused by a different fungus. You'll get some of this yellowing, you'll get leaf spotting. It's just that the leaf spots will be varying in size. And with early blight, you will get also get stem lesions that look like that with those concentric rings. And but typically we don't see fruit symptoms. So it's mainly on the stems and the leaves. You won't see as much of this, bottom up dying of the leaves. It'll just sort of be all over the plant. And there are resistant varieties for early blight. So, these resistant varieties are bred for resistance to specific diseases. When they do these breeding programs, they go and, spray a bunch of healthy plants with spores of that particular fungus, and then they select the ones that survive, and they cross those and get more and more resistance with each generation. So, a variety that's resistant to early blight is not going to be resistant to Septoria leaf spot unless they were both, in the same breeding program. And in fact, we don't yet have a commercial variety that has resistance to Septoria leaf spot, but we do have those varieties for early blight. And early blight is different from late blight. Okay, late blight will kind of wipe the whole plant out really fast under the right conditions. Early blight is more of a, you get some spots and then you get some more spots, and it doesn't kind of kill the plant outright very fast. Does that answer the question? I'll go to stop sharing. Other questions? Let's see. Okay, there's a question about, that's kind of a long question. And the bottom line is, there certain soil I can mix in this winter to help prevent some problems that you're having with a variety of plants. I'm a beginner gardener. My house has had almost no plants in the flower beds. We put a layer of topsoil down and then mulch the spring, but I'm seeing yellowing and brown spots on my roses, strawberries, and a few other plants. And some of my rose stems now turning brown and dying. Okay. I think that those problems, this is from Steve, I think those problems are not related to the soil, although the healthier the soil is, the healthier your plants are going to be for sure. And, it's good that you incorporated mulch, and, it can take a while to really build that soil, but you want to keep adding organic matter. That's the important part. So topsoil alone is not going to provide you with a really healthy soil. You want to keep adding organic matter. Some of the problems that you're seeing, like on roses and strawberries, those are two plant species that get a lot of different leaf diseases. So it's not surprising that you're seeing spotting on those. And as far as the roses stems turning brown and dying, that often happens over winter. So that could have simply been cold injury. Roses will also get a fungal canker disease. And when you prune them, you leave a long stub, then that is very susceptible to infection by these canker-causing fungi. So you always want to prune next to a side shoot, at an angle next to a side shoot or a bud, rather than leaving a long stub. That can help you prevent some of that dieback in the roses. But I would just say, yeah, continue to build your soil. And, when you're choosing your vegetables, try and pick disease-resistant vegetables. Strawberries get a lot of diseases, but they're probably worth growing anyway. They're so good. So then you can consider some fungicide controls for some of the diseases. And I'll mention that, I know some of you guys are from Kentucky and not Virginia, but you have a similar system in Kentucky. In fact, I know the diagnosticians over there, and they're really good. So, if you're ever wondering what kind of problem you have on your plant, then get a diagnosis. It's like I said on that first slide. If you don't know what caused it, you're not going to be able to make an informed, disease management decision. So get a good diagnosis. You need something other than a plant that's already dead. So you need a plant that, is in the early stages of symptom development, and collect, the right tissue that you need for somebody to diagnose that problem. It may be a whole plant, it may be several stems with the leaves attached, and submit that through your local county extension office, and they'll take a look at it. If they need to send it to the lab, they'll do that. And then you get a lab diagnosis, and then you can get a more specific control recommendation. Steve says, also I'm plucking spotted leaves off before spraying a copper fungicide weekly. Any other tips or certain brands of fungicide? I'm super discouraged since we put so much work in this year. Yeah, I get it. It sounds like you're doing the right thing. I mean, obviously a copper fungicide is not going to work if you got a nematode problem. So like I said, get a good diagnosis, and then you'll see if you're applying the right control. And picking the spotted leaves off, that's a good idea, although, you may not be able to get ahead of it that way. I would suggest that you put more time next year, if it's too late this year, to picking out some varieties of the vegetables and other plants that you want to grow that are resistant to some of the common diseases, or are, if you're talking about ornamentals, just plants that tend to not get as many problems. So some colleagues and I, some years back, put out a couple of fact sheets called problem-free shrubs for Virginia and problem-free trees for Virginia. And there are species of plants that are less prone to disease. So do a little research on that. Our fact sheets are a little out of date, but most of those species that we mentioned are still pretty good. And so try to start with, plants that are less prone to problems. I know that's kind of a general response, but okay. Greta says, I suspect that I mostly get Septoria then, no matter how I try to protect the plants from the soil splashing. Okay, so maybe Greta is the one who asked about the early blight. And yeah, if you, I don't know about Kentucky. I mean, everybody talks about early blight, and I almost never see it. What we always see is Septoria. So if you're seeing that bottom up leaf death, then probably you do have Septoria, and you can protect those plants with fungicide. And I actually used a biological control, and I didn't have time to talk about all this stuff, but there are biological controls that are made of living organisms that are antagonistic to these pathogens. And I used Serenade 1 year on my plants, and this is anecdotal, but it seemed to do pretty well for the Septoria. So you can use, a general fungicide. And like I said, there's a page in the pest management guide that lists all the common fungicides that are available for home growers. And most of those are broad spectrum fungicides that will work for most of these leaf diseases. So you can choose like a copper fungicide or, mancozeb, or you can try one of the biologicals. And the important thing is to get it on a regular basis, because like I said, they're protectants. So they have to be in place when that pathogen lands on the plant. So if you just, if you're like me and you're really well-meaning and you get out there and spray early and then you run out of time and you never do it the rest of the season, you can't expect that fungicide to work all season long. On the label, it'll tell you how often you have to spray to maintain that protective coating. So I think you can get ahead of Septoria if you're willing to spray on a regular basis. Where can I get plants and soil tested? Never mind, you answered. Okay, very good. What organic matter do you suggest? I never have time for my garden, so I can't tell you from my own experience, but my husband goes and gets composted leaf litter from the town, I think. And he has been incorporating that into our soils with good results. So that's one kind of free source of organic material that you could look for. So that's what we use. Greta, I'm not from Kentucky. I found the session you are giving on a friend's Facebook page, and I'm glad I did. Yay. Okay. My local plant pathologist is known as Dr. Death. Okay, yeah, we plant pathologists have a bad reputation. People come in our lab with a sick plant, and we try to control ourselves, but we typically will say, cool, which is usually not what they want to hear. So I get it. Okay, other questions? Anybody want to speak up and talk to me? Go ahead. Has anybody had any of these problems in their garden?
I have a problem. Last year, I tried pulling all the bottom leaves off of my tomato plants, and it seemed to help. Is that not a bad idea, or?
Well, I mean,
problems nearly as soon as I normally would have.
Okay, great. I mean, one thing that does is it's controlling that environmental side of the disease triangle. So you're opening up the canopy underneath and probably getting better air circulation. So definitely those types of controls are not going to give you 100% control, but they're going to slow down a disease, because many of these leaf diseases, and certainly the ones I talked about tonight, are fungal. Or they're oomycetes, which act like fungi. So both of those types of organisms love a really humid canopy, and anything you can do to open that up, the regular pruning of your tomatoes and staking of them helps to increase air circulation. So certainly removing those leaves does as well. Now, if you remove too many leaves, then you maybe could affect your
just enough to keep them all
production.
Down, basically.
Yeah, and definitely, a lot of these soil-borne organisms actually attack the roots and the lower stem. So, but there are, a lot of these pathogens can survive on plant debris that's on the soil surface, and if you've got leaves lying on the surface or fruit, then you can get direct infection of the fruit from that. So yeah, definitely, I think, you notice that anecdotally, but I'm not surprised that that would be helpful in slowing down the disease. And Just slowing down the disease can be an important control measure. Even if you get the disease, you still get more yield. So that one variety of basil that I showed you that was called Eleonora, that was our former sort of best variety of basil before they came up with these really good resistant varieties for downy mildew. But that Eleonora, it wasn't really resistant, but it got the disease later in the season. And so you got more basil out of it. So yeah, I'm all for delaying the disease and, getting more yield.
How about parasitic nematodes? Are they worth it?
Like adding them in?
Yes.
Okay. If you ask it depends on who you ask. If you ask our nematologist, that's definitely a great idea. I don't know of any research results that show how helpful that is. So do you have a specific product in mind?
I did something at my last house and we sprayed it and we didn't seem to have any nematodes. And it was one of those that comes in the mail and you keep it in the refrigerator and add it to water and just spray it on the soil.
Yeah, I doubt that really did anything. I mean,
we just got lucky.
Yeah, probably. There are actually nematodes that are sold as biological control products for certain insect problems, because there are insect parasitic nematodes that will infect insects. And so, depending on what you got, it may not have, I don't know if it was for controlling the nematodes themselves, but those insect controlling nematodes, that is a valid product that apparently works. But I don't really know of anything that I would recommend for controlling nematodes, as a biological control product. Now, there are these cool fungi that occur in some soils that are called nematode trapping fungi. And they develop a ring and the nematode swims through the ring and then the ring clamps down and chokes the nematode. And those are, those have been, people know that that's happening in the soil ecosystem, but I don't think a product has been marketed that really stimulates, enough of those fungi in the soil to be effective on the nematode population. So I think for nematode control, you're going to have to rely on some of those things that I mentioned, like resistant varieties and, planting marigolds for a year and turning them in, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Good question, though.
Thank you.
Mhm. Anyone else? We're at a good point in the season here where none of our vegetables have diseases yet, but I'm sure you'll think back to me as the season goes on and you start seeing some of these diseases.
Marianne, there's a question about the use of neem oil as a fungicide.
Yeah. Okay. Neem oil is an effective fungicide for things like powdery mildew, and I can't quite remember all the things that it is registered for. But yeah, that is an effective fungicide. And I believe that can also be used for some kinds of insects as well. It's a product from the neem tree, which I actually got to see one time when I went to Ghana in Africa, and they had these trees growing in this village where I was, and a lot of the bark was missing. And I said, "What is that?" And they said it was the neem tree. And I said, "Wow, that's where neem oil comes from." And the local people there would chip the bark off and they would cook up a tea and they would use it as a fungicide. And they said it was effective. And they also used it as in like a tea that they drank for keeping themselves healthy. So I don't know all of the possible things that neem oil can do, but definitely there's some active compounds in there, and that is considered an organic control. Oh, what's the difference between using a fungicide versus neem oil? Well, neem oil acts as a fungicide, so it's a type of fungicide. It's just from a you know, directly from a tree, and it's not a synthesized chemical. So. Oh, the beneficial nematodes are recommended for iris borer. Okay, very good. That's what I was saying. Like there are nematode products that will control insects. So I didn't know they had one for iris borer. I know they have some biological control nematode products for insects that are problems in turf. But that's interesting. I'll have to talk to our entomologist about that. Let's see, what else? Let's see, around here we have to be careful of local leaf litter due to jumping worms. Okay, sounds like you don't have the problem. Okay, I've heard that from some of my colleagues about these jumping worms, and they look pretty weird. So I've seen them on other people's slides, but I have not seen them. So that's an interesting thing. These are kind of weird critters, and I do not know much about them because they're not plant pathogens. But probably you don't want to get them. Yeah. Other questions?
Good discussion. Any other questions for Mary Ann?
Sorry to go on so long, but you guys have good questions.
No, I'm glad you're here. All right. If there's nothing else, I want to thank you all for logging in, and Mary Ann, again, thank you for an excellent program. Very good and timely, and I think answered a lot of questions our folks have.
Good luck with your gardens this year, and thanks for inviting me. It was fun.
And Shad and Jeremy, do you all have any comments? I think we've got one more Zoom coming up.
I just want to say thanks so much. Great information. Good discussion there at the end. So I thank everybody for putting those questions in the chat. Great topic.
Excellent.
Yeah,
presentation.
it's fun when people have questions. It's a great group. Thanks.
We do have one more session coming up. We're off next Tuesday, but next Thursday we will have a outdoor gardening or outdoor grilling by Martha Yount with the University of Kentucky, and she will be giving a phenomenal program on outdoor grilling. So definitely tune back in for that one. So, and I think that's going to be our last one prior to the summer. So we're going to kick it off with some summer grilling.
Have fun. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.